Happy Thursday and welcome to this week's edition of Offit Kurman's Remote Rundown. I'm Jim Reese, Director of Business Development at Offit Kurman, and each week I'm joined with labor and employment attorneys Russell Berger, Sarah Sawyer, and Veronica Yu for a conversation about the latest and most relevant employment issues related to COVID-19 and advice for owners and employers on how to best deal with these issues. There have been plenty of developments since last week, so Veronica, please kick us off with today's discussion.
So now that, and this has come up a couple times this week from some of our clients, but now that businesses have utilized those PPP funds, since they've been dispersed, there now comes the problem that there's a cash flow issue and they need to make the tough decision as to whether to furlough and lay off employees again, and how they're going to go about doing that. And I'm still getting the question, what's the difference between a layoff and a furlough? So the concept of a furlough is that it's supposed to be temporary and the employee remains an employee and continues to receive benefits even though they're not working. As opposed to a layoff where that's a more temporary, a more permanent situation and the employee is no longer employed and the employment relationship ends. And the issue here is with the pandemic, we're not really sure how long businesses will be impacted by it. So it's difficult to say whether this is temporary or permanent. And it really is just based on your business and what's going to make most sense for how to handle this going forward. One thing I will note is when you're making these decisions, to make sure that they're not have the appearance of being discriminatory. And as you talk through with your team on how you're going to go about making these decisions, it's important to internally document the reason for each employee's change in status and tie it to the legitimate business reason that you're doing it. And I think that will be a good layer of protection moving forward.
And along those same lines, there's also something called Disparate Impact in the anti-discrimination law. And what that means is if certain protected classes are impacted more so than you would expect them to based on the overall analysis, then there's a potentially a claim of discrimination there as well. And that's an analysis that frankly I somewhat like doing that kind of work because it's spreadsheet driven, it's statistical analysis, it's the law has cooked into it certain ratios and standard. You have a prima facie case for the violation of the law if you're more than 2 standard deviations apart from one protected class to another. So there's really some interesting data analysis that needs to go in, especially if you're talking about larger numbers and the sample size becomes relevant. There's some data analysis that needs to take place when you're doing that as well. One other thing that I'd mention, if you're getting to the stage where you're thinking about having to lay off or furlough employees, is you need to think about how that impacts PPP forgiveness, especially now that Congress has revised the law and there's a 24-week period in which to use the funds. If you're going to take advantage of that 24-week period in which to use the funds, June 30th is no longer your deadline for employee counting. So if you're getting to that point, you should talk to counsel and you should figure out how it affects your forgiveness, because you don't want to try to engage in some cost savings measures that actually end up costing you more in the long run because you don't get that forgiveness.
Yeah, it's interesting that I think we've been finding ourselves when it comes to layoffs and furloughs and those pieces, kind of in a position where we're addressing this with clients again, whether it be as they're making these PPP decisions and as they're assessing the future, or I've seen with clients where they have, now that the dust has settled, they're starting to look at their business model and look at redundancies, or this whole pandemic has kind of put them in a position where they are reevaluating evaluating how their business operates and if they want to be bringing back employees for the long term and what that looks like, and having to do that analysis again of ensuring that they're not, making decisions that have a disparate, impact, or they're not inadvertently even just impacting one group of employees that are of a similar protected class, or really doing those types of analysis. I'm also seeing that because at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of employers furloughed employees, and they were very hopeful that they'd be able to bring employees back. If they now are in a position where they're not bringing them back for business reasons, or have decided to go in a different direction because of the way that their business model has changed, that they're seeing some anger and frustration from employees that they're not bringing back for those reasons. So, that makes a lot of employees even more motivated to potentially make claims, whether it be discrimination claims, or even, they start stirring up other issues that they think they might, they might have, like overtime issues or different types of issues, just out of the frustration and displeasure of not being brought back. So that's something that I've been seeing with some clients that have made those decisions recently.
Good. Well, this seems like a good time to pause. I'd like each of you to leave us with your takeaway from today's discussion. Let's start with Russell.
Right now, I think the key takeaway is planning. And last week we talked about planning on the practical side. I think this week we're talking about planning on the financial side, and whether it's, making sure you're going to get your PPP forgiveness, or coming up with a way to lay off or terminate or furlough your workforce that mitigates your risk. I think that's all important planning that, it should be taking place, and will set you up well for the next steps as we get more into recovery.
Veronica, key takeaway?
I think we say this probably to some degree every week, but documentation is so important. Like Sarah said, a lot of disgruntled employees or people that are really feeling the stress of the pandemic are filing these different types of claims against their employer, and your best defense is documentation. So just being thoughtful about your decisions and making sure to back them up.
And Sarah?
I think at this point that employers are really starting to become, they're in a position where they're able to kind of step back and look at the bigger picture and look a little bit longer term strategically. So, I encourage businesses to start to do that, and, really start to take a step back and think about the next, the rest of the year, and what that looks like in the current climate, and as things are changing, and what their long-term strategy should be to continue operating as we hopefully are pulling out of this.
Okay, great. Good advice. So we'll end it with our trivia question. This time we will start with Sarah for the trivia question. I've made it really easy for you all with a multiple choice question. You just choose one answer. The question is, during the quarantine, what have you spent more money on? First answer would be groceries. Second would be alcohol. And the third would be home improvements. Again, what have you spent more money on during the quarantine? Groceries, alcohol, or home improvement projects? Sarah?
I'd have to say be alcohol. I live near Union Brewery and some good places that were doing some awesome carryout deals. So that was something that, I really wanted to do. The local spots. My favorite place, Holy Free Holies, was doing to-go margaritas and things like that. So I probably indulged in those types of things a little bit more than I usually do.
Excellent. Veronica?
I would say groceries. We've been trying to eat better during the quarantine, and that just means making a lot more meals. So definitely groceries.
And Russell?
I think groceries by a mile.
Yeah. Remember, the groceries include paper goods, right?
Yeah, right, right. Unless you count furniture, because I had to set up a new workspace in my house. So, there's that expense too.
That's a good point. We might include that in home improvement projects because it is a home improvement.
See, you ask lawyers a multiple choice question. We're going to find a way to mess it up for you.
All right. Well, thank you all for today's remote rundown, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Jim.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye.